The southern colonies were established mostly for the sake of profit or politics. But there were other English colonies to the far north which were founded mostly for the sake of ideas and religion. And the difference has had a lasting impact on the nature of American culture. I'm referring, of course, to the colonies of New England, or to put it in the terms New Englanders would have best understood, the Puritan colonies. The term Puritan was not invented by the Puritans, and in fact, it was not invented as a compliment. It is a complex and often ambiguous term, but in the shortest possible words, Puritan refers to England's most radical Protestants. Finding them on the shores of North America, along with Maryland Catholics and Georgia paupers, may seem odd at first, since Protestants were the big winners in the struggle for control of English society and religion. What were these Protestants doing in the snowy forests of New England as though they were on the low rung of the ladder like everyone else? The answer to that question lies in the peculiar way that the Protestant Queen, Elizabeth, made England Protestant. Elizabeth had no love for Catholics. Her Catholic sister Mary had threatened Elizabeth's life while Mary was briefly queen, and Catholic assassination plots surfaced with chilling frequency during Elizabeth's lifetime. They were a threat to her realm, they were a threat to her person, and she dealt with them according to those lights. But if Catholics were unhappy at seeing England made Protestant by Elizabeth, there were also Protestants who were unhappy that she had not made England Protestant enough. Under Elizabeth's eye, the Church of England, the Protestant denomination, the Protestant state church created by Henry VIII for England, under Elizabeth's eye, the Church of England embraced Protestant thinking by adopting the 39 Articles of Religion, a thoroughly Protestant statement of Christianity if ever there was one. But she allowed the Church of England to retain its Catholic-style governmental structure, with bishops ruling dioceses like aristocrats, and every English subject an automatic member of the English Church. She also sanctioned, as Queen, a worship manual, the Book of Common Prayer, in 1559, which used enough Catholic-sounding language to make committed Protestants squirm. And she allowed the clergy of the Church of England to retain the old-time forms of liturgical dress. Protestants, inclined to squirming about these things, advised Elizabeth to jettison these holdovers from the past. But Elizabeth was in no better mood to take their advice than she was to take the advice of the Catholics. And she treated Protestant critics as just as much a threat to the stability of her realm as the Catholics. She handed down orders for them to conform, and they refused. When they refused, she had them hunted down, arrested, and punished in just the same way that she did for her Catholic subjects. These radical Protestants, these critical Protestants, were called at first precisians because they wanted to be so precise about every detail of life in the Church of England. And then, eventually, the term Puritan was attached to them. Elizabeth's hostility to the Puritans posed a dilemma for them, and I mean a dilemma entirely apart from the dangers of persecution. The Puritans wanted to think of themselves as just as loyal and just as English as Elizabeth herself. They'd like to think of themselves as the cutting edge of what England was really called to be, and that is Protestant. But in truth, they owed spiritual allegiance to a transnational ideological movement known as Calvinism. John Calvin played only a comparatively minor political role in the Protestant Reformation, but his teachings had enormous influence on the thinking of every Protestant country in Europe, whether they eventually agreed with him or not. Put in a nutshell, Calvinism taught the complete and absolute control by God over all human affairs. It also taught that not only was God absolute in his control of human destiny, but humans were morally helpless. Why? They were morally helpless because of the inherited effect of the sin of Adam against God in the Garden of Eden. Consequently, if the human race was ever to be redeemed from the bondage of sin, it was a work that God would have to undertake out of his own initiative and out of his own mercy. Now, this kind of thinking was not actually completely new or novel. Teachings like this had been in circulation in Christianity ever since St. Augustine and the end of the Roman Empire. But in the explosive political climate of the 1500s, they struck Europeans with the force of a storm. If God was absolute, if God ruled all human events according to his own lights and by his own wisdom and his own plan, that meant that God was totally sovereign. And if God was totally sovereign, kings were not. If kings contradicted God, God and not the kings should be obeyed. If the kings persecuted you as a result, they only did so by God's permission as a test of your faith. Calvinism, in other words, bred resistance and defiance to kings, and also, for that matter, to anyone else in authority, since one could just as easily substitute bishop or queen for king in that equation, and the result would be pretty much the same. So despite the best efforts of Elizabeth and her bishops to silence Puritan criticism in the Church of England, they did not obligingly disappear. If anything, they began to multiply. Because if Puritan theology had a short-term pessimism about human nature, if Puritan theology believed that human beings were rendered helpless by sin, they still had a long-term optimism about the future and about the power of a sovereign God. Now, some Puritans wanted the Church of England reformed from within, and they worked to promote Puritan-minded clergy to the ranks of the bishops. Some wanted bishops abolished entirely, and the government of the Church of England turned over to local committees of clergy, or presbyteries, hence the name of this group of thinkers, Presbyterians. The most radical of the Puritans elected to leave the Church of England entirely and set up their own churches, where membership was entirely voluntary, not based simply on the fact of being born English, and was tested by specific signs of sincerity, rather than merely being the accident of you being an English subject. Operating independent churches was, of course, in the 1500s in England, illegal. People then could no more think of more than one kind of church in a nation than we can imagine the different states of the United States each adopting a different form of government, a monarchy here, a dictatorship there, a republic over there. It also involved a kind of cultural treason against England to try to set up your own independent church. And both the stay-in sort of Puritans and the Presbyterian kind of Puritans fought with and dissociated themselves from the Separatist Puritans. In 1620, a small band of these Separatists took their ideas about church and government and took them to their logical conclusion, hired themselves out to a joint stock company that wanted to plant a trading post on the shores of New England, and left England entirely. How's that for independence? We call these Separatists a little misleading, but we call them the Pilgrims, and we usually give them more than is probably their due in the history of early America. They were the smallest, the least popular, and the most radical of Puritans. And it has to be said that they did not come to America to found a new nation so much as to get rid of an old and corrupt one. None of these disagreements among Puritans endeared either the stay-in Puritans or the Presbyterians to Elizabeth. The fact that they wanted to put as much distance as they could between themselves and the Separatists meant nothing to Elizabeth. From her perspective, they were all cut from the same cloth. And Elizabeth's successors, James I and Charles I, took an even dimmer view of the Puritans, no matter how they defined themselves. Charles I, in particular, pursued Puritans with special venom. And by the end of the 1620s, even the stay-in Puritans were losing hope and wondering if the only real alternative was to imitate the Separatists and flee to America. But they could not quite bring themselves to admit that they were contemplating flight, because that would endanger their contention that they were really only loyal Protestant Englishmen who loved their king and loved their church as well as any other Englishman. So as much to allay their own anxieties, as much to deceive themselves as to deceive royal snoops, harassed and harried Puritans, thinking of emigration, organized themselves not as a Puritan exodus out of a corrupt English Egypt, but as a humdrum joint stock company, the Massachusetts Bay Company, complete with the usual corporate board or general court and charter and the usual company president or governor, who in this case was a Sussex lawyer named John Winthrop. They were not, they told themselves and they told the king's officials, they were not Puritans on the run. That was what Separatists did. They were just Englishmen interested in doing business in New England who all just happened to be Puritans, purely accidental. And they were not Separatists. They would go to New England just as sound members of the Church of England as they ever had been, whatever that meant. The Massachusetts Bay Company's fleet of 11 ships and 700 pseudo-employees left for New England in the spring of 1630. No one paid enough attention at that time to the fact that, contrary to English law governing corporations, neither Governor Winthrop nor the General Court nor the Bay Company charter stayed in England. They all took ship with the fleet to America. And thus, before anyone could stop them, the government of the Massachusetts Bay Company was legally and geographically well out of the reach of any second thoughts on the part of King Charles. Once they made landfall in New England and set up a settlement on Massachusetts Bay, which they named Boston, Winthrop and the General Court became not just the heads of a joint stock company, they became the de facto government of a Puritan Massachusetts Bay. And so, for the first time in their lives, the Puritan settlers of Massachusetts Bay could breathe freely as Puritans. And within that freedom lurked a problem for John Winthrop. The Puritans of the Bay Colony had left England swearing up and down that they were not separatists, they were not trying to dismantle the Church of England. But once they were in Massachusetts, with no royal officials looking and listening, there would be a vast temptation to throw off these promises and these excuses and begin pushing Puritan radicalism to its limits, if there were any limits. John Winthrop had anticipated this, and as governor, during the voyage across the Atlantic, he had warned his fellow immigrants in these terms: "We must be knit together in this work as one man. We must entertain each other in brotherly affection. We must be willing to abridge ourselves of our superfluities, our luxuries, for the supply of others' necessities. We must uphold a familiar commerce together in all meekness, gentleness, patience, and liberality. we must delight in each other, make others' conditions our own, rejoice together, mourn together, labor and suffer together, always having before our eyes our commission and community in the work, our community as members of the same body. For we must consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill. There's that telling phrase for the first time in our history. We shall be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us, so that if we shall deal falsely with our God in this work, and so cause him to withdraw his present help from us, we shall be made a story and a byword through the world. To be sure, there was every reason to believe that Winthrop's Puritans would take this warning about the need for oneness, solidarity, community to heart. The Puritans, after all, who came to New England were a far cry from the freebooters and street sweepings that populated so many of the other European colonies. Take, as a comparison, the passenger lists of 3 emigrant ships which left England for America in 1635. 2 of these ships, the Merchant's Hope and the Elizabeth Delow, were bound to Virginia with 114 settlers. But of that 114, 72 were single men whose average age was 20, and all of them appear to have been going as servant labor. An unnamed passenger ship leaving Weymouth in England for Massachusetts carried, by contrast, 126 passengers, but among them were 13 complete households. In other words, husbands, wives, children, servants. And the average age of heads of those households was 36, the midpoint of life expectancy in the 1600s. In other words, the people bound for Virginia were footloose and poor. They were not a community. They were not bound together. In fact, they were so overwhelmingly young and male that they have all the difference from the ship that went to Massachusetts Bay as you would imagine between, let's say, a company of new Marine recruits and a Sunday school class. The people bound for Massachusetts had stability. They had families. They had firm ideas already shaped by years of experience about the kind of community they planned to erect, and so one might suppose that they would have taken Winthrop's words about community to heart. But ideas are volatile things, and radical ideas can drive apart stable communities of families just as easy as garrisons of short-tempered gentlemen can be driven apart. Winthrop seems to have imagined that his description of Massachusetts Bay as a city upon a hill was to be taken literally, that Boston would be the only settlement, and that all of the Massachusetts Puritans would submit themselves there to the oversight of the governor and the general court. They showed no such thing. In 1631, Puritans crowded onto Boston's tiny peninsula, and then some of them moved across the Charles River and established Charlestown without so much as a by your leave. They were followed in short order by settlements with names like Dorchester, Roxbury, Lynn, Watertown, Ipswich, Newbury, Concord, and Hingham. All of these were beginning to look like cities upon a hill rather than a single organized city. In 1635, one Puritan minister, Thomas Shepard, actually migrated entirely out of Massachusetts Bay and founded a settlement on the Connecticut River named Hartford. John Winthrop found that he had little power this far from England to curtail the itching of his fellow Puritans for movement. In fact, when he tried to intervene in a case in Hingham involving the promotion of a militia officer, Winthrop was indicted before the general court by the Hingham settlers for exceeding his authority as governor. This was only a sign that Puritan ideas could become as unstable as Puritan communities. In 1631, a radical Puritan named Roger Williams landed in Massachusetts and at once began advocating the conversion of the Massachusetts Bay churches into Separatist congregations. Winthrop was having none of it. He intervened, and in 1635 he arranged to have Williams banished to Narragansett Bay, where Williams organized his own Separatist colony of Rhode Island. Then in 1636, a radical laywoman named Anne Hutchinson bitterly divided the churches of Boston by teaching that God's grace and sovereignty was so mysterious and so ineffable that no authority, not even the Bible, could stand in the way of its operation. Winthrop did not like hearing this either, and Winthrop trapped her, too, when she began spouting what sounded like private revelations from God, and Hutchinson, too, was banished to the Dutch settlements on Long Island. Winthrop could hold off the most radical of the separatists and crackpots, but he could not prevent the drift of the Puritan churches and the Puritan ministers ever more towards separatist forms of church organization. One by one, churches in the Massachusetts towns redefined the idea of church membership to exclude any who could not give a believable and detailed relation of their faith. Individual congregations came to regard their power over their own affairs as absolute and rejected any attempt to substitute higher civil and church authorities for that of the individual congregation. Without actually using the word separatist, Massachusetts became virtually a settlement of separatists, and its churches became jealously guarded congregations. Hence, the name that gradually came to be applied to the New England churches, Congregational. Given the drift of Puritan ideas, maybe the drift into separatism was inevitable. The anti-authoritarian bias within Puritanism, based as it was on Calvinist ways of thinking, all of that made separatist congregation the logical endpoint of Puritan thinking. And just as nature abhors a vacuum, so it seems that no idea rests until it has reached its extreme. But whether this process was inevitable or not, the fact was that nobody in England was checking up on it. And the fact that the first generation of settlers had not endured suffering and sacrifice as Puritans in England merely to come to New England and practice the same old half-hearted version of church reform, made it easy for Massachusetts to slip in the separatist direction. Change those two facts, however, and matters could take on a very different cast. John Winthrop, for instance, died in 1649, leaving behind a personal journal that is one of the most remarkable documents of any European settler of the 1600s. With him, Massachusetts' first generation of Puritan settlers began to pass off the scene. And within a decade, alarmed ministers across the Bay Colony began to notice that the rising generation, who had either been born or raised in New England rather than Old England, lacked the spiritual edge which had been forged by their fathers and mothers in the fires of persecution. Gradually, the numbers of New Englanders willing and able to run the gauntlet of the relation of their faith and become church members on that basis, that number began to decline because the urgency to do it that way had declined. Of course, Massachusetts Bay retained on its statute books a variety of laws which compelled all of the colony's people to attend their parish church on Sundays, but these were indifferently enforced. And even when they were enforced, all that the statutes accomplished was to fill the churches with people who did not qualify to be church members, could not participate in the sacrament of Holy Communion or have their children baptized. This was not, obviously, the way to be a city upon a hill. And the ministers were not shy about pointing this out. The disarray of the churches in Massachusetts was matched by the accelerating breakdown in Massachusetts community life. Boston increasingly became a town of merchants rather than saints, with its eyes on building up trade in Europe rather than treasures in heaven. Per capita income rose steadily from 1650 to 1715 by 1.6% annually. And as in so many ages, the rich got richer and the poor, well, you know, they got poorer. As it was in the town of Salem, the amount of wealth owned by the top 10% of the population rose from 21% over that same period of years to 65%. New Englanders also found less sanctified ways of spending that wealth. The first Boston brothel began operating in the mid-1650s. And between 1690 and 1720, the number of slaves bought by New Englanders increased by 6 times. West of Boston, as the second and third generations of New Englanders came to maturity, and as they married and looked around for land to settle upon, they found that less and less land in their hometowns was available. So, the pressure to find new land forced them westward, and then westward again, and then south and north as well. By the 1660s, New England had broken up not into just a series of disconnected towns, but 6 separately organized colonies: Massachusetts Bay, New Hampshire, New Haven, Plymouth, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. What's more, the first generation of Puritans had gotten along reasonably well with the neighboring Indian tribes, the Wampanoags, the Narragansetts, the Mohegans. Although the getting along reasonably well had a good deal more to do with the smallpox that preceded the Winthrop fleet and so hideously decimated the New England tribes that they could offer little in the way of resistance to the Puritans than it was to Puritan good intentions itself. But by 1675, the growth of the New England colonies had pressed the New England tribes so far that in June of that year, a Wampanoag chieftain known as King Philip raised up an alliance of threatened tribes and struck the New England towns with hurricane force. Almost half of the Massachusetts and Plymouth towns were burned. Between 500 and 600 settlers were killed, scores of others tomahawked, raped, sold into slavery. King Philip's war drove the Bay Colony's ministers into dire warnings that the original Puritan vision had been betrayed by the fecklessness and materialism of its children. What then is the cause of our coolings, faintings, and languishings? Asked Samuel Danforth, the minister of Taunton, Massachusetts, in 1670. The grand and principal cause is our unbelief. Danforth explained it in these terms: we believe not the grace and power of God in Christ. And for that reason, God is visiting upon New England his judgment. Not only the war, but the breaking and the snapping of the Puritan underpinnings of New England drove the ministers into a creative frenzy. And from that emerged an entirely new style of preaching, the sermon known as the Jeremiad. Now, the Jeremiad takes its name from the denunciations of evildoing that you find in the Old Testament book of the prophet Jeremiah. As such, the Jeremiad was really the first American literary form. It was also a howling catalog of New England's moral shortcomings. But once that was said and the congregations appropriately browbeaten, the Jeremiad did a remarkably creative thing. It announced that between the original model and the sordid reality, God still had a purpose for New Englanders, and would renew and revitalize their mission. Why hath the Lord smitten us with blasting and mildew? Asked Samuel Danforth again. The answer? So that we may remember where we came from and why we came here. Attend we our errand, said Danforth, upon which Christ sent us into the wilderness, and he will provide bread for us. If the people cleave to the Lord, to his prophets, and to his ordinances, it will strike such a fear into the hearts of enemies that they will be at their wits' ends and not know what to do. This kind of call to cultural revival was not a new one. The European Renaissance of the 1400s was one kind of cultural revival. The Protestant Reformation of the 1500s saw itself as another. But the Jeremiad firmly sets this notion of cultural revival into the cluster of basic American ideas that we all still live with. And the Jeremiad would prepare New England and the rest of British North America for the greatest cultural revival, the greatest cultural explosion that it would ever see.